We are back working on the tracker project. In this episode we'll start the paint job. Is it possible without experience to do an epic custom paint job in your garage? Let's find out. There are three parts that need to be painted. It's the fuel tank of course, the cowl and the front fender, which I don't know if I showed on this channel yet. The fender and cowl are made out of carbon fiber. If you're interested in how I made these, leave a comment and I might make a video about it. The fuel tank is in an okay condition, but it has a pretty nasty dent on one side and it has started to rust. If I don't deal with the rust now, it will get worse and eventually the tank will start to leak. I'm working to get the emblems off here. It went fairly well. One of the screws gave me a hard time, so I had to drill it out. And fun fact, screwing this up is also a way to get your fuel tank to leak. But fortunately for me, it went well and the rest of the screw came out easy with a pair of pliers once the emblem was gone. For the cowl and fender I started by roughing up the carbon surface to get good adhesion with the Bondo. These were laid up by hand without vacuum pressure, so there were some obvious air pockets that had to be filled. After I sanded them down, it became quickly apparent that it's really hard to see imperfections on these parts, so I decided to paint them in order to spot where they needed more work. To get rid of all the rust, the decision was made to take the tank down to bare metal. I was really excited to try paint stripper. I've seen multiple videos here on YouTube where it's just applied and the paint basically runs off in a time-lapsed video. Needless to say, that did not happen for me. It barely made a difference. The paint was really stuck on there. I even tried different brands of paint stripper. This could partially be my fault too. I think I might have waited too long once I've applied it. Perhaps it would have gone easier if I would have scraped it while the paint stripper was still running. Meanwhile, the endless cycle of sanding, applying filler, sanding again, and then painting was going on for the fender and cowl. I was too aggressive with the electric sander in the beginning. That caused low spots on the curved surfaces that I'm dealing with at this point. I was also struggling with the old paint on the tank. After several rounds of paint stripper, it's possible to see progress, but power tools really made the big difference here. After a while I got really tired of the slow progress and brought out the angle grinder with the metal brush. What I'm doing here is potentially dangerous. This tank has been empty for several years, but that does not mean that heat or sparks cannot set off an explosion. You should take real care when doing work like this in a fuel tank. I was careful not to use a lot of pressure and regularly felt the metal to ensure that heat was not building up. But when I'm doing something like this that I do not recommend, I will show this symbol on screen. The rust beneath the emblem bracket is a real problem. I can't just leave it. So the brackets had to be removed. They are spot welded in, so I had to grind them out. These small cut-off discs for the Dremel are one of my favorite tools. They can do some really delicate work and are very versatile, even for tasks like this that they aren't designed for. In the end, I got it looking like this, and afterwards the other side got the same treatment, of course. Then it was time to deal with the actual rust in the cavity itself. I started by cleaning it out with a wire brush, then I used a rust converter to make sure that the rust was taken care of. For the cavity I decided to use glass fiber Bondo to fill most of it. It has better structural properties than normal Bondo, but it's harder to sand to a nice finish. I also picked up some Bondo mixing technique while doing this. Apparently you're supposed to smear it out and flatten it as you are mixing to minimize air bubbles. Not just stir it like a maniac like I've done up to this point. Then I roughed up the surface for the fine Bondo. I wish I could say I got it spread perfectly the first time, but sadly I had to do this a couple of times to get a base that would blend nicely with the tank. One really good tip is to make sure that you have a clean putty knife while doing this. It's easy to be lazy and don't clean it properly beforehand. It came back to bite me a time or two. And we're back with everyone's favorite activity. For shaping the filler, I recommend using an 80 grit paper, or else progress will be painfully slow. One last thing before it's time to spray. The underside of the tank was really in the worst shape by far. It was a lot of rust in the nooks and crannies. I did my best to clean everything off, but I decided to coat the entire underside with rust ether before painting. Unfortunately, I did not get any footage of the first layer, but here is the second. First things first, I set up a makeshift murder room to try to prevent overspray in the entire garage. The compressor I'm using is a 1500 watts with a 24 liter tank, stats on screen. It was barely enough. It had to recharge after spraying half a top side of the tank. It did the job, but I recommend something with a larger capacity. The primer is a grey acrylic filler that mixes 5:1 with the hardener and 30% thinners. I'm spraying it out of a 1.8mm nozzle. The gun I'm using is a Develbis FLG5, and according to my research is the nearest thing to a professional paint gun for a quarter of the price. With that said, this is my first time spraying, so I can't really give you an opinion on that. Let's go! the results. Unfortunately, the dent is still a bit visible, but we'll deal with that. Watch the next video to see how it turns out, or why not check out the project playlist. Have a good one!